Good evening. Your Eminence, Archbishop Gregorios of Thyatíra, Great Britain. Your Excellency, Ambassador of Greece in the United Kingdom, Dr Dimítrios Καραμίτσος-Τζιράς. Your Excellency, High Commissioner of the Cyprus Republic, Mr Ευριπίδης Ευριβιάδης. Your Excellency, Chancellor of the Republic of Turkey, Mr Sinan Kuzum. Your Lordship, Lord Raidgar, Honourable Dr Lευτέρης Κρέτσος, Secretary General of Communication and Mass Media of the Greek Government. Distinguished academics, ladies and gentlemen, we welcome and thank you all for attending this UK public awareness event named The Catalist Role of Minority Rights in a Nation State, the case of the Greek community of Turkey. The format for this evening's event is we start with the presentations after we have a welcome presentation from the Minister, and then I would invite each speaker to speak for about 20 minutes each, and we'll then have question and answer session at the end of both presentations. So if you can wait with your questions right till the end, it will be much appreciated. So, I would like to invite Dr. Lευτέρης Κρέτσος to give us a short welcome address. And for your information, Dr. Krechos is a senior lecturer at the University of Greenwich, Greenwich Business School, Department of Human Resources and Organizational Behavior. Dr. Krechos, the floor is yours.
Your Eminence, Archbishop Gregorios of Thyatíra in Great Britain, Your Excellency, Ambassador of Greece in London, Mr. Δημήτριος Καραμίτσος-Τζιράς, ladies and gentlemen, dear speakers, organizers, distinguished people of the Greek community in London, I would like to thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor for the Ministry of Digital Policy, Telecommunications and Media, my Secretariat for Media and Communication, to participate and help in the organization of the event, which I think is extremely important for many reasons. But please also allow me to thank the head of our press office here in London, Alexis Georgiadis, for his efforts to make this event happen, as well as Voula Geveleki, the first Chancellor of the Embassy of Greece in London. So thanks Alexis and Voula, because you really worked hard for this. I would also like to thank the Ecumenical Federation of Constantinopolitans. I always confuse this with cosmopolitans, but Constantinople is always a cosmopolitan place. So certainly there are many reasons to praise and admire the Federation. I think the most important reason for that is the very fact that you have never stopped remembering even the most dark moments of the history of the Greek community in Constantinople. It demands a lot of strength, a lot of courage to live with your trauma and the suffering or remembrance of your own night of broken glass. So you are the reason that we also remember all that has defined us to a lesser and greater extent today. You keep the image of the great city of Constantinople alive. You hold the torch of a history that goes back over 2,000 years. So the events of September 1955 have stigmatized our collective memory in Greece. Even if, in my view, the Greek state has not really done much for decades to talk about this issue in detail. For example, we never really understood what really happened in schools in 1955. And what really happened, in my view, you could call it a modern fall of the city, even if we have to understand that history is complex, sometimes it's full of contradictions, parameters that are not easily observed. And of course, the events of the September of 1955 were linked to the peculiarities of the period regarding the Cold War, the conflicting national interest on the Cyprus issue, and so on. It's a stylized fact, unfortunately, though, that the Greek community of Constantinople were the scapegoat, the convenient guilty, and what really happened, as I said, were strongly linked with other developments that are related with Cyprus. Nevertheless, drawing strength from your determination not to let it go, but to remember, we must keep acknowledging that it's our duty to maintain close links with our history. And allow me at this moment to say something as a personal experience when we tried to organize and help in the organization of a similar event last year in Piraeus. So on that time I asked people, my associates in the General Secretariat for Media Communication, if we have any related material regarding the September 1955 in our archives, and we realized that we had more than 700 photographs that capture this landmark time in our modern history. In browsing those pictures, we had the opportunity to reflect on a real tragedy. So we identify a lot of things, among others, of course, pictures of the vandalism, details of the damaged Zapio school, and so on. So the point that we came after all this reflection is that we have to continue on the digitalization of our historical archives, and something that I'm pretty sure that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other public institutions in Greece will help us to do so, is to create an archive regarding the Hellenic diaspora in order to create elements and items like the one we created last year, a very short documentary entitled September 55, Capturing the Tragedy. So the diaspora archives will work for the promotion of the Greek language and culture, and I had discussions also about it with BBC people today, because I think we really need to bring BBC back with the Greek language. There are 33 languages at the moment that BBC is serving and delivering its own content. I think we have to move forward also with the Greek language. And I think that all this aspect of digitalizing archives, historical archives, help us to see the reality and understand modern and our past in a much more clearer way. And of course, a greater achievement from all this effort would be if we manage to empathize the pain, the adventure, and the suffering that people, our people, had in dramatic times like the ones that we are going to discuss today. So I would like to stop here. I think this is said too much. I would like to thank again all the organizers, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Krέτσος. Indeed, we have to reflect on a lot of past events, and digitization, I think, sure is one way forward. So, I would next like to invite the keynote speaker, Professor Nicolaos Uzunoglou, to the floor. Professor Uzunoglou was born in 1951 in Istanbul. After his graduation from Zografion Lyceum, he studied electronic engineering in the Istanbul Technical University and continued his postgraduate studies in the UK at the University of Essex. He has been a member of staff at the National Technical University of Athens since 1980. He has been elected 4 successive times as President of the Ecumenical Federation of Constantinopolitans. In 2011, His All Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomeos I assigned him the officium of Protector of Letters. Quite rightly. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Panos Anastopoulos. Σεβασμιότατε, His Eminence, Honorable Ambassadors of Republic of Greece and Republic of Cyprus, Honorable Counselor of the Republic of Turkey Embassy in London, distinguished academicians, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start thanking the General Secretariat of Information and Mass Media of Greece, making possible this event. And of course, all of you participating to this meeting. Let me say a few words about what is this Ecumenical Federation of Constantinopolitans. It's the federative body, the federation of expatriated, of a community that forced to leave contrary its desire, the members contrary to their desire, outside of their native land, Istanbul, Constantinopolis. It was established by, presently has 30 member associations. 20 of them are from Greece, the rest are from European countries, Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, Austria, from United States, several towns, cities, as well as Australia. My talk will focus on 4 key issues. A review of the history of the Greek Orthodox community after 1923. The sources of anti-minority state policies during this period until beginning of the 21st century and their consequences. And the fact that the unbreakable relation of strengthening the rule of law and respect of constitutional fundamental rights with the status of minority rights. And the importance of remedy and reparation in the context of a very significant, little known maybe, United Nations resolution, a general resolution, 6147, and the efforts of our federation towards the government of Republic of Turkey on this direction. The international status of this community is defined by the very well-known Lausanne Treaty. We have the best expertise with us, Mr. Bruce Clark, on this issue. The Greek community, the Greek Orthodox community, more correct, as according to Lausanne Treaty jargon, was exempted from the population exchange. And it's important this point is very important that it's defined in the treaty that all type of Greeks are exempted from population exchange. In Turkey, bil cümle Rumlar. That means that because the community initially was about 300, it dropped to 150,000 for several reasons. The whole atmosphere led to this, but also there was a different interpretation between the French and the Turkish text concerning whether was the border of non-exchange region, whether was it the perfect or the metropolitan municipality. And the metropolitan municipality was much more smaller. That's why there was a significant depletion of the population. Now it's important to state the following thing. This is a very important point. This population that was exempted from the population exchange consisted of 2 components. The ex-Ottoman Empire citizens, which were receiving the new citizenship of New Turkey, about 100,000, and while there were 25,000 citizens of Greece, which were also accepted from the population exchange. Actually, in Lausanne jargon again, Lausanne term, the term in French language, the établi was established for those accepted from the population exchange. Now, let's remember a little the Lausanne Treaty. It's a whole section, the protection of minorities. Article 37 states that Turkey undertakes that the stipulation containing in Articles 38 to 44 shall be recognized as fundamental laws, and that no law, no regulation, nor official action shall conflict or interfere with this stipulation, nor shall any law, regulation, nor official action prevail over them. Article 38, it's the beginning, the Turkish government undertakes to assure full and complete protection of life and liberty to all inhabitants of Turkey without distinction of birth, nationality, language, race, or religion. And actually this was also implemented in the constitutional laws of Turkey later in 1924, in 1960, etc. Article 39 says Turkish nationals belonging to non-Muslim minorities will enjoy the same civil and political rights as Muslims. Article 40, Turkish nationals belonging to non-Muslim minorities shall enjoy the same treatment and security in law and in fact as other Turkish nationals. In particular, they shall have an equal right to establish, manage and control at their own expense any charitable, religious, and social institution, any schools and other establishment for instruction and education, with the right to use their own language and to exercise their own religion freely therein. In Article 41 is about the educational rights. Article 42 is the Turkish government undertake to take as regards non-Muslim minorities insofar as concerns their family law or personal status, measure permitting the settlement of this question in accordance with the customs of those minorities. In the same article, the Turkish government undertakes to grant full protection to the churches, synagogues, cemeteries, and other religious establishments of the above-mentioned minorities. All facilities and authorization will be granted to the pious foundations and to the religious and charitable institution of the said minorities at present existing in Turkey, and the Turkish government will not refuse for the formation of new religious and charitable institution any of the necessary facilities which are guaranteed to other private institutions of that nature. Article 43, Turkish nationals belonging to non-Muslim minorities shall not be compelled to perform any act which constitutes a violation of their faith or religious observances, and shall not be placed under any disability by reasons of their refusal to attend courts of law or perform any legal business on their weekly day of rest. Of course, this was changed. As you know, in Turkey, Sunday was introduced as a public holiday a few years after. This provision, however, shall not exempt such Turkish nationals from the obligation as shall be imposed upon all other Turkish nationals for the preservation of the public order. And Article 44, Turkey agrees that insofar as the preceding articles of this section affect non-Muslim nationals of Turkey, this provision constitutes obligation of international concern and shall be placed under the guarantee of the League of Nations. And finally, Article 44, the rights conferred by the provision of the present section on the non-Muslim minorities of Turkey will be similarly conferred by the Greece on the Muslim minority in her territory. This is a very critical article, many times is misused under the title of reciprocity principle, which we will discuss later. Now we have the period from 1923 to 1940, the war started before that. There were several severe violations. First of all, there was a serious intervention to the Greek school. There were firing of hundreds of teachers, interference with the internal affairs of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Actually, in 1925, on the beginning of 1925, there was a deportation of the Ecumenical Patriarch, Constantine VI. This is also an issue, what I'm going to tell to you is a pending issue, still an open issue. There was an establishment with state support of a pseudo-Turkish Orthodox Patriarchate by an ex-Orthodox priest, Eftim Karaherissaridis Erederol, whose family members to this day illegally occupies 3 churches in the district of Karaköy, Galata. These churches are very rich. These Karaköy, with its old name Galata, was the economic center of the Ottoman Empire, and these churches were very rich, and still this injustice is continuing for 80 years. And dismissal all the Greek employees from state offices and foreign companies which were during the Ottoman Empire. This is also an important issue. Here we have an expertise on this issue, Dr. Vasiadis. In 1924, a famous academy, actually this was a so-called Greek Literary Society, in Turkish is Dersadet Rum Edebiyat Cemiyeti. It was closed in 1925, 24, 25. They had a very rich archive. It was actually an organization having association with the Royal Society of London or Académie Française. It was a sort of ministry of education of the Ottoman Greeks. This society was closed. Its very rich archive was transferred to Ankara, and it's one of the issues that we are discussing with the government of Turkey to reinstate the library of this institute again in Istanbul. We read in the Treaty of Lausanne that the right of the minority to continue its family law. This was abandoned, closed in 1925. The National Council was dissolved by pressure. Now, in my talk, I would like to emphasize this point. This is a conclusion after many years. Despite that during the period 1930 to 1940, the relation between the states of Greece and Turkey were really cordial, to the level that both countries they were discussing to establish an Aegean confederation, still the measures against the minority were continued. And this is the fact that what happened to the minority is independent either of the Cyprus issue or the difference between the Greece and Turkey. And we see when the two states are in a very good relations, still, unfortunately, the policy of violations against the minority has continued. One example, in 1932, when there was a so cordial relation between the leaders of the two countries, a law was passed, it's 2007, the number of the law, 20 professions were prohibited to the component of the Greek citizens. Now in 1930 Ankara Agreement, which was a sort of annexing, changing, modifying Lausanne Treaty, these 25,000 community of Greek citizens were binding to this treaty, which was a severe violation of Lausanne Treaty. Unfortunately, nobody noticed this, and this was used later, many years. A serious confiscation of properties of Greek foundation took place in 1936 with a new law, and the most important, the elections to these foundations were prohibited, and members of the community were appointed, selected by the government. This is still an open issue which come again today, which we'll discuss later. The worst violation, unfortunately, happened during the Second World War. There were two very severe measures. When in May 1941, Germany occupied the Balkan countries, with a secret decree, all the youth from 18 to 45 years old, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, were forced to work battalions, to work in work battalions, and this was a very hard measure. Economically, the community was hidden. As you understand, this was the active population. This photograph actually is the Virgin Mary Day in 15th of August, and as you see, most of the people are quite old. In 1942, November, a law passed in the parliament, a very short law with 2 articles, saying that war conditions around the country has imposed severe economic condition to the country, and we need to impose an extraordinary tax. Law looks to be valid for everybody, but as was seen later, and importantly, the person who implemented the law has disclosed later few years, this law was used for economic destruction of the minority communities. What was happening, as you know, Turkey until 1946, 1950, it was a country ruled by a single party. The local leader of the district was guessing how much one member of the minority can pay. It was an arbitrary tax. It should be paid in few days. If you are not able to pay this tax, all your property was confiscated, it was auctioned, sold in auction, and if this was not sufficient to pay the tax, you were arrested and sent to work camps. And it happened that those people that were arrested were old, 60, 70 years old. They were sent to Ashkale. It's called the Siberia of Anatolia, and 2,500 such persons were sent to Ashkale, and 25 died, while most of them died when they returned to Istanbul, because the conditions were such that after a few months, when they returned, their health was completely shaken. Everybody was hopeful when the war finished. Turkey was becoming, Republic of Turkey was a founding member of the United Nations. Minority members were hopeful that things will improve. And it has been proved that in 1946, the Republican People's Party, which ruled the country until 1950, in 1946 prepared a secret report about minorities. It's called Minority Report. It was stated that now the existence of Greeks outside of Istanbul is non-significant. However, in the anniversary of the 500 years of the Ottoman rule of Istanbul, should be celebrated without the presence of any Greeks. This was disclosed in the PhD of Dilek Güven in 2005. Now, what proves this? Proves that the events of 1955 had nothing to do with the Cyprus issue, had nothing to do with the Greek-Turkish relation. It was an internal problem, absence of rule of law and respect of laws and the constitution of the country. Of course, the beginning of anti-colonial struggle by Greek Cypriots in 1950 provided the opportunity and reason to implement this plan. During 1952-55, part of the press systematically fueled the fire of hatred against Greeks in general and demonized them as enemies of the state. Especially the newspaper Hürriyet was the main instrument to carry out this program. The Turkish state supported and facilitated the establishment of an organization, Cyprus Turkish organization, with branches throughout the Turkey. In 1 year, had branches in everywhere in Turkey, and this organization acted as a coordinator of attacks against the Greeks of Istanbul. Again, I state that all this happened while the relation between Greece and Turkey apparently were enjoying a honeymoon. Prime ministers from both sides were visiting each country. The King of Greece visited Istanbul. So it's important to understand that the problem was human rights and internal respect of the laws of the country itself. We go now, Mr. Krέτσος mentioned about this night, actually today is the anniversary. It has been proven by Turkish tribunals that there was a provocative action in Thessaloniki by agents provocateurs. A small explosive material was placed on the house of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. At the same time, a newspaper was printed 4 days before the event, and while this newspaper was printed usually in numbers 5,000, that day circulated 300,000. It happened that just after the provocation, the Greek police arrested the perpetrators. However, these were returned to Turkey, and the leader of them, Oktay Engin, he was a person that served to implement these violations of human rights and violation the laws of the Republic of Turkey. This event is a tragic page in the history of Republic of Turkey. Today, many newspapers in Turkey, they call it is the most dark day in our history. In less than 1 hour, around 7 post-meridian, attacks started against the Greek institution and properties in all the European and Asian districts of Bosporus, in the old city, which is inside the walls, and the Prince Islands. At the same time, in a region of 60 to 30 kilometers, attacks is starting, is proving that this is organized before. And actually, the whole operation was in 3 stages: destruction of doors, second group was looting, and the third was setting fire. The targets were the 64 Greek churches, cemeteries, foundations, schools, hospitals, shops, houses. Also, attacks were perpetrated against the Armenian and Jews. The battle cry that doomed was, today is for your properties, tomorrow will be for yourselves. The police forces, unfortunately, were indifferent, in some cases encouraging the attackers. The mobilization of the army units came very late. These photographs, you see, it came from an archive of an admiral, Fahri Çoker, late Fahri Çoker. In his will, wrote that these photographs should be published after my death, and came out in 2005 in the 50th anniversary of the events. The results of the pogrom: destruction and arson of 71 churches, destruction and arson of 20 schools, 5 sports clubs, destruction about 4,500 shops, all the newspaper establishment, extension, destruction of cemeteries. This is important. The message that we're trying the attackers to give to the community, that your roots should not remain in this place. Destruction of 2,000 houses, about 37 Greeks died, and also the number of rapes were very large, despite they were not reported for known reasons. Also, events took place in Smyrna, where the Greek consulate was burned. These photographs are from late Dimitris Kaloumenos. It was a Greek photographer. He took the photographs the next days, the destruction. I show you a few photographs from the churches. These are from the region of Psomathia. And in the photographs you see the priest is the Patriarch, Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras, visiting a church. And the patriarchal tombs were also destroyed. Afterwards, the destruction continued more than 12 hours. Despite the proclamation of martial law, the destruction was exceeding, according to American sources, $1 billion at that time. The most important issue, however, was the moral blow against the Greeks who experienced the sacrilege of their sacred values and relics. The government of the Republic of Turkey refused its involvement and incriminated the few Turkish progressive intellectuals as organizer, that being a communist plot. These were freed after months, because there was no any evidence that they did such thing. 3,000 pogromists were arrested. However, they didn't try it, and they were freed after 3 months. The government of Turkey attempted in every way to conceal the fact that there was an organized plan to exterminate the Greeks of Constantinople. The effort to hide the events failed because of the picture taken by Dimitris Kaloumenos and later transferred by the journalist George Karagiorgas, a prominent journalist outside of Turkey, proved the fact. The compensation to the victims ended up in a political game, and finally the compensation given was only 10% of the damages. As you know, in 1960 there was a military takeover of elected government in Turkey. It's very important to say the fact, this is my personal experience. The next day, one of the first communiques of the military officer, the communique, was that the decision of this takeover was taken the day after of 6-7 September. So as you see, these are very linked, the two diversions of the rule of law. One of the trials took place, it was a facade, as we know now. These trials taking place in an island near Istanbul, was the events of 6 September. Unfortunately, the trial was trying to blame everything to Prime Minister, ex-Prime Minister, overthrown Prime Minister, and the real perpetrator were hidden. Oktay Engin, the provocateur in Thessalonica, was freed. Now, one important document, fact came out in many years after, in 1992, in an interview with a journalist from Temop magazine, Sabri Yermibeshoglu, a general that for many years was the commander of the Special Welfare Directorate of the General Staff of Turkey, stated that the organization and execution of September 6-7, 1955 operation was magnificent. In Turkish he used the word muhteşem and was completely successful. He denied later this disclosure, but Fuat Sipahioglu is a serious journalist who was interviewed. It's the fact that the community remained in Istanbul, didn't leave Istanbul. So the whole issue, the whole pogrom was in some sense unsuccessful. Only 10% of the Greek Orthodox community members, they left Istanbul. It's an important fact, a detail, that in these trials of 1960, Refik Tulga, a general, that time was also commander or governor of Istanbul, he asks from the tribunal a secret session. It's the only secret session in these one-year trials. In this secret session, which was published in 2007, the minutes of the trial, it stated that Celal Bayar, the president in 1957 of Republic of Turkey, told him that we have an important instrument to make this community to disappear. We will expel the Greek citizens of the members of the community whose status was in a gray area. As I told you, this was disclosed in 2007. So there was a planning of these exiled members of the community. Now, another important issue to understand is that in 1962, a special minority community was established under the Prime Minister's office. Prime Minister was İsmet İnönü. This committee has not to do really with the minority rights. It has to do with the security services, with the general staff. That's because the minority members were considered an internal enemy. This community was in force until 2004. the AKP government, the presently ruling the country party, dissolved this committee in 2004, and this was an important step towards healing the injustices. In 16th of March 1964, Turkey unilaterally declared that the Ankara Agreement of 1930 was cancelled, and as a result of this, it stated that these 12,500 Greek citizen members of the community will be deported. Again, this is the most serious violation of Lausanne Treaty, because these members has not to do with the 1930 Ankara Agreement. It was they were exempted to the population exchange. Actually, this measure was very harsh. Usually what was happening, there was a visit to the house of those to be deported. He was called next day to visit the 4th section of the security police. They were forced to sign a letter without seeing what is written. Probably it was written that they were helping Greece and Cyprus. And then they were asked in few days to leave the country with $20 and 20 kilograms items. What's happened that many families, they had one member Greek citizen and the rest were citizens of Turkey. So the whole family was leaving. These are photographs, those that have been deported, with the stamp that they had carried out actions against the Republic of Turkey. Even disabled people were deported. This really was a tragic period. There was a campaign of boycotting the Greek shops. The plate you see, it says that, be careful, if you buy from this shop, these are being used as bullets against our brothers in Cyprus. Greeks of Istanbul, they didn't know where the Cyprus was, many of them. During this period, there were many other in parallel oppressive measures. Vice directors, Turkish vice directors were appointed to the Greek schools, which were coming to destroy the school. Today is the opposite is happening. Really, the directors are the most important supportive of the Greek schools. Another example I will give you, they were members of the community that in their identity cards, it was not written Greek Orthodox or in Turkish Rum Orthodox, but it was written Arnavut Orthodox. Why? Because they were from the region of Albania belonging to Ottoman Empire. Their ancestor came to Istanbul. About 200 children, school children, were prevented to continue their studies in the school. These were devised by this special minority community. And of course was a serious violation of the constitution of the Turkey, being Turkish citizens, these people, and also all the international law that were signed by the Turkey. The results was that about in a 6 months the population dropped from 90,000 to 30,000. I think these graphs mention the fact. As you see, the community started with 125,000 members. Until 1955, more or less the population is the same. During the Second World War, the two severe measures didn't have effect because nobody can leave Turkey. Greece was under German occupation. In 1955, the community remained, resisted. But in 1964, the results was really destructive. And the population, as you see, has been now a few thousand, less than a few thousand. As I mentioned to ex-Prime Minister Professor Ahmet Davutoglu when we met in Athens in the embassy of Turkey, that we are the only case in European post-war history that we are living as expatriated community up to 90–80%, including, of course, the islands of Imbros and Tenedos, with today's names Gökçeada and Bozcaada. Come to the next point. What are the sources of anti-minority state policies during this period? Analysis of the human rights violation against the Greek community leads, according to our conclusion, to the following results. The primary source has been the nationalistic ideologies, conceiving any difference from assumed ideal citizen as potential danger. The non-Muslim minorities, in principle, were declared as potential internal enemies. The tensions or the good relations of the states of Greece and Turkey were irrelevant on the implementation of anti-minority measures. Only timing of pre-planned measures were linked to the relation between the two states. While the citizens belonging to Muslim religion of majority, Turkey is a majority Muslim nation, were also severely persecuted. Still, the nationalist practices exploited the religion as instrument against the non-Muslim minorities. The violation of Constitution of the Republic of Turkey and the international treaties endorsed by Turkey affected not only the minority, but all the citizens of Turkey. This is true even Republic of Turkey in 1954, many years before Greece, has been the country endorsing European Convention of Human Rights. The other conclusion is that the inability of a judicial system to protect human rights of minorities. This is because secret decrees discriminating were binding the independence of tribunals, and as a result, different unpublished laws were used to discriminate minority member citizens. The properties of the deported 1964 was frozen for many years. This was by a secret decree. The judge, many times the judges were deciding in favor of the Greeks, asking the protection of the tribunal, but they were forced not to apply their rulings. The hate publication by part of press throughout 1950-2000 against the minority were systematic and unlimited. As I told you, the Special Minority Committee, which was dissolved in 2004, played a very essential role of this derailing the human rights inside the country. Although the above-mentioned mechanisms have been abolished, the consequences of the past injustice practices continues to still pose serious problems to minorities. The unbreakable relation of strengthening of rule of law and respect of constitutional fundamental rights with the status of minority rights. In 15 May 2010, the Prime Minister of Turkey, now is the President of the Republic, Mr. Erdogan, issued a circular drawing the attention of all state authorities abandoning all practices of discriminatory measure against the minority citizen. This is a very important document. On numerous occasions, himself as well, declared that what happened to minorities was a fascistic state attitude by the previous governments. A parliamentary commission in 2013 investigating the military interventions recognized the fact that the pogrom of 6/7/1955 was pivotal in the development of this constitutional diversion in the country. And the restrictive measures towards the minority welfare foundations were eased in 2008, a law passed allowing the return of their real estate properties, and the implementation of the law allowed only part of the properties, while many issues still are pending. This confiscation of the welfare foundation done with a ruling of the higher court, and the argumentation was the following: while these minority members are citizens of this country, but still are foreigners. So they were stamped with the title foreign citizens. Nobody can be foreign and citizen of the country. And according to this, their welfare foundation cannot receive new donations after 1936, where there was a registration of their property. So on a massive scale, the properties from 1936 to 1974 was confiscated. Part of them, they have been returned with this law on 2008. Turkey has signed and ratified the United Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, but still the administration has difficulty to implementing sometimes this. Unfortunately, Turkey, which is effect for the Greeks as well, has neither signed, Greece has signed, but didn't ratify the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities of European Council. And this is our position, that Turkey, Republic of Turkey, should sign. For Greece, of course, they have to sign also, our opinion. Now, this happened, and the fact is that all what happened, the mechanisms were disclosed by honest historians within Turkey the last decade. What one has to do? Of course, one has to register what happened, but has to look forward for the future. And this instrument I mentioned, the resolution, I advise you to read this resolution. It's a very important document. It's a result after 25 years of work of committees. Theo van Boven, Al-Sharif from Egypt, they have prepared the work. And what should be done to return the time back? Time cannot return back. But still you can do the best to heal the past injustices. So our strategy is the following. First of all, atrocities in the past must be recognized, documented, and learned from, but not distorted or misused for political purposes. This is a statement, important statement by Thomas Hammenberg, who was Commissioner of Human Rights of Council of Europe. It's a fact that despite the progress of the respect of human rights based on the landmark European Convention of 1950, the Rome Convention, the issue of remedy and reparations towards the victim communities because of massive scale violations still remain in a transitional state. This is a serious weakness of the whole institution of human rights. The promise of respecting human rights in the future doesn't mean anything if a state doesn't look back and try to correct the misuse and heal the trauma has caused to victim communities. This is the resolution of United Nations. It was a unanimous resolution in 2007. The last 5 years, as Federation, we have direct discussions, contacts with higher functionaries of the government of Republic of Turkey. Our proposition, first of all, was the reinstitution of citizenship. 40,000 members of our community were stripped of systematically of the citizenship. There has been a progress on this, and citizenships were reinstated either for those who lost the citizenship or for the next generation. There are some problems, and we are trying to solve them with direct contacts. The second statement, if this community, this autochthonous, oldest community, let's say, of these lands, should survive, a state-funded project for the repatriation of young members of expatriate communities should be implemented. Despite numerous submissions of proposals, response has been received in a limited scale. In this context, a proposal to establish a research institute. We have 300 leading professors all over the world, Greeks of Constantinople, with a contribution of the Constantinopolitan scientists from various universities abroad has been proposed. Proposals remain unanswered. The survival of the community is directly linked to the solution of the problem faced by the minority community in Istanbul, which are primarily the following. First, still now we have a problem again. From 2013, while the elections were carried out about for 8 years. In 2013, again, the elections in the Welfare Foundation, Minority Foundation, were prohibited with a pretext that there would be a new regulation. 5 years has passed and still we are waiting. This is a very important issue. Another issue is the so-called fused or merged welfare foundation. The state, despite recognize historic monasteries that they belong to the community, doesn't allow the administration to be carried out by the minority, and the manager is appointed by the state. In Prince Islands, all the historic monasteries from Byzantine era are under this status. Greek community has 70 foundations. This system was to serve 300,000 population. The population now are few thousand. 70 foundations cannot be managed by few people. That's why our proposition is to have a committee, a second-level structure to coordinate these welfare foundations. Another significant issue is the guaranteeing the individual property rights. It's true that all these secret decrees now has been abolished. The tribunals, they are trying with rightness the application, but there is a serious issue violating against the law of the country. There were groups that they were exploiting these forgotten properties, and in many ways they're trying again to exploit. We have raised this issue in Ankara to Ombudsman. There were some measures. Our proposition is that the state should establish a service to provide support and guidance to the victims for their individual property rights. The illegal continuing occupation of the Greek Orthodox churches, historic churches, they are also from Byzantine era, by this family of Eftim Karahaseridis ancestors. This is actually in tribunals, in Turkish tribunals, probably will go to European Court of Human Rights. These churches, as I told you before, they have enormous fortune, real estate. And the important issue of Theological School of Chalki, which is closed from 1971. This was a school that functioned from 1843, from the Republic, and also during the whole Republican area until 1971, and the pretext of prevention of private university was closed with illegally, and should be open, of course. Now, our conclusions, which is especially valid for the Greek Orthodox community of Turkey, but in many nation states, this is valid as we observe. In nation states, the violation of human rights of minority communities is directly linked with the absence of rule of law principles, which affects the whole population. This is especially valid in our case. The suppressive measure against the minority rarely stems from relation between states. And in the context of respect of human rights, it's vital to integrate strongly the necessity of remedy and reparation measures toward victim communities, which is important for strengthening democracy and rule of law. After all, the endorsement of these are for the benefit of all the citizens. And this is valid also, of course, for Turkey. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Uzunoglou, for this thorough, objective, very precise account of the events of September 7th, 1955, as well as the account we just, for me, it was a history crash course, compressed. It really is food for thought, especially in these days of populism amongst certain countries. So, our next speaker, I would like to invite Mr. Bruce Clark, Mr. Clarke was educated at Shrewsbury School, where he excelled in academics, particularly in classics, and continued to study philosophy at St. John's College, Cambridge. His book, Twice a Stranger, which I've read and thoroughly recommended, goes to great depth on the population exchange between Greece and Turkey in 1923-24 and received the Runciman Award in 2007. He writes for The Economist and his articles focus on religion and ethics. Mr. Clarke.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Distinguished guests, I could say my lords, ladies and gentlemen, including Lords Spiritual. Anyway, it's a great honor to address such a distinguished audience. Because of my own experiences, the experiences that I've been lucky enough to have, I felt that the most useful contribution I could make to this evening's discussion was to talk about the Patriarchate and indeed the Patriarch himself, and what an extraordinary blessing to the Church and indeed in different ways to humanity His All Holiness has been. I've been lucky enough to take part in almost all the Patriarch's environmental symposia. They've been extraordinary events, they've made history, and indeed it's worth recording that, of course, the 7th of September is a black anniversary in many ways for the relationship between Greeks and Turks for the Aegean region, but it's also in one way a happy anniversary. Exactly 10 years ago to the day, on the 7th of September 2007, the Patriarch arrived in Greenland for perhaps the most ambitious and far-reaching of his environmental events. And he led a voyage down the coast of Greenland and bore witness by his presence and by his words to the environmental challenges facing the polar regions of the world at a time of melting glaciers, at a time of rising sea levels. It was an extraordinary event in world religious history, and I regard myself as very lucky to have been present at that event. Going back for a moment, and going back to my academic interests, it is a miracle in a way that the Patriarchate survives in its home city. This is one of the most ancient institutions of any kind in the world. The current Patriarch is the 270th holder of that office. And indeed, if all he had done was simply survive in the 25 years since he was enthroned, the world would owe him respect for that. Because merely surviving in his vulnerable circumstances would have been quite a feat. But he has done much, much more than that. He has actually responded very, very creatively to the dilemmas in which he finds himself, to the vulnerable position in which he finds himself. He has given a very creative interpretation to the word Ecumenikos, Ekumeni, which literally means the entire inhabited world. And he has taken on a kind of voluntary responsibility for the fate of humanity as a whole and the fate of the created earth, which in no way involves an assertion of power or domination. On the contrary, it's a mission of service, a mission spoken out of vulnerability, a mission of simply being ready to reach out to people in ecologically sensitive places and to offer solidarity, even in places which are culturally very, very far from his home base. Let's think back for a moment to the negotiations in Lausanne in late 1922, early 1923. The future of the Patriarchate was one of the most controversial issues. In fact, it has been said that 22 of the 26 sessions devoted to minority questions in Lausanne were dominated by the future of the Patriarchate. The starting point of the Turkish delegation in Lausanne was that it was absolutely appropriate that the Patriarchate leave its home city. It would have no place in the new Turkish Republic. And in a sense, there was a certain grim logic in the argument. The idea was that the Patriarchate perhaps had a place in the theocratic era of the Ottoman sultans, the Sultan was a kind of theocratic institution, and so was the Patriarchate. But in the new secular Turkish Republic, there would be no room for such an institution. And no less a person than Mustafa Kemal himself made that argument in an interview that he gave on Christmas Day, December the 25th, 1922. But there was extremely powerful resistance to that idea, not only from Greece, of course, from Venizelos, but also from Britain in particular, from Lord Curzon, and in particular from Lambeth Palace, from the then Archbishop of Canterbury. This was a time, I suppose, when religious affairs probably counted more in Western diplomacy than they do now. And Lambeth Palace certainly had a strong input into British policy at that time. And what the diplomatic records show is that the British delegation was extremely firm in arguing for the maintenance of the Patriarchate in its home city. The French delegation a bit less so, and indeed the Italian delegation distinctly lukewarm and prepared to say that perhaps the expulsion of the Patriarchate was a price that could be paid for an agreement on other fronts. But it's worth recalling that Lord Curzon, who was the most powerful person at the Lausanne Conference, said actually on the 10th of January 1923 that the expulsion of the Patriarchate would be a stain on the conscience of the world. Now, it was that very day that there was a dramatic change in the Turkish position. Only a few days earlier, on the 4th of January, the Turkish representative Riza Nur had been absolutely firm in his insistence that the Patriarchate be expelled. He had said, in fact, that if the Greeks persisted, and if the world persisted in trying to keep the Patriarchate in its home city, then Turkey might respond by simply unilaterally expelling all the Greeks from the city. It would solve the problem once and for all. And a fallback Turkish position was that we will consider allowing the Greek population to remain in the city, but only on condition that the Patriarchate be expelled. In other words, they wanted to sort of remove the spiritual authority over the Greek community, and it was presented as a condition for allowing the Greeks of that city to stay. That was in the first few days of January 23. On the 10th of January 23, the same day as that statement from Lord Curzon, there was a sudden change in the Turkish stance. At 10:30 in the morning, Riza Nur said that the Fana could not remain under any circumstances in its home. Literally half an hour later, he returned to the negotiating hall and said that he was authorized to change his position, and the Fana could, after all, stay. But it would be on the understanding that this would be a purely spiritual institution, that it would not have any of the political or administrative functions which it had had in Ottoman times. And so clearly a sort of compromise had been reached behind the scenes. Nonetheless, there was some amazement in Lausanne when Riza Nur changed his position. Some people have said that such was the grateful amazement that Turkey was, after all, prepared to allow the Patriarchate to remain in its home city, that people didn't actually pin down the conditions for the Patriarchate to remain as well as they should have done. A number of things were left vague, in particular whether the Patriarchate would be allowed to style itself ecumenical, or whether it would simply be a purely local episcopate. And that's been, broadly speaking, the Turkish position ever since, is that the Patriarch is the shepherd of his local flock and doesn't have any international role or shouldn't be styling himself ecumenical, although President Erdogan himself has been quoted as saying that he personally doesn't see that as an important issue. In any case, the survival of the Patriarchate over 17 centuries has required many miracles, and that was surely one of them. If we think of the patriarchs that served in the Ottoman era, between the 16th and early 20th centuries, there were 159 patriarchs who held office, and 105 were forced to renounce the throne under varying degrees of duress. One of them was the patriarch Cyril Kyrillos Loukaris, who was enthroned and dethroned 6 times. It's worth recalling that he was remembered in history as somebody who leaned in a somewhat Protestant direction, and the times when he was dethroned was under pressure from the Catholic countries' embassies in Istanbul, and the times when he was re-enthroned were more under the pressure from the Northern European, the Protestant embassies, so to speak. So there have been many adventures, many peripetias in the history of that institution, and the 20th century was certainly no exception. Now, imagine the situation when the current patriarch came to office. In some ways an extraordinarily difficult situation, but one that also contained opportunity and promise if it was correctly seized. He was coming to office as a well-educated, multilingual, diplomatically able person, quite young in his early 50s, and he seemed well placed to build on those foundations. And yet it was, to put it mildly, a difficult time in European history. There were new fault lines opening up in Southeastern Europe, with the fall of communism, the collapse of Yugoslavia. A famous political scientist was predicting a clash of civilizations with religion as the main dividing line, and with Orthodox Christians on one side and Catholics on another. So it seemed very natural for the patriarch, when he was enthroned, to recall the words of St. Paul, God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. I dynamis en asthenias delute. And that's been one of the themes of his patriarchate ever since, that he is speaking out of vulnerability, and he's in a sense making a virtue or an opportunity out of vulnerability. It's in this vulnerable spirit that the patriarch has organized 8 waterborne symposia, which highlighted the environmental challenges facing the earth, and in particular the lakes, rivers and seas of the earth. The first of those symposia consisted of a voyage from the patriarch's home city to Patmos, an island very dear to his heart. In fact, the whole idea of involving the patriarchate in environmental matters started with his predecessor, Patriarch Dimitrios, who was a humble and holy man who, by force of circumstance, wasn't able to venture outside the patriarchate very much. Only towards the very end of his reign was he able to travel to places like the United States, but he spent a long time as a virtual recluse, and nonetheless managed to do at least 2 important things. In 1988, he blessed the holding of an environmental conference in Patmos, which for the first time put on the table the idea that the fate of the earth, the physical fate of the earth, was something that religious people should talk about. And in the following year, he had the idea that September the 1st should become an annual day of prayer for creation, for the fate of the earth. That idea has steadily gathered pace ever since, and this year it has been observed extraordinarily well, literally by hundreds of millions of people. This was the first year when there had been messages on September the 1st from the Pope, the Patriarch, the World Council of Churches. In fact, the whole month of September has been dedicated to the environment, and this month of creation will culminate on October the 4th, when we will have a whole series of announcements by churches about disinvesting from fossil fuels. So what began as a modest proposal by a quite little-known patriarch, Patriarch Dimitrios, has become a very important event in the religious calendar of the world. Returning to the witness of Patriarch Bartholomeus, his first symposium was a voyage to Patmos. It was on the reflection of a reflection on the theme of apocalypse, what apocalypse meant in the biblical sense, and what it could mean in the physical sense in our times. The second one was a voyage around the Black Sea, drawing attention to the whole sort of diplomatic and spiritual possibilities opened up by the end of the Cold War, and the fact that a number of historically Orthodox lands were now able to be in touch with each other in a way that they weren't before. This was a symposium which highlighted the danger that the already lifeless state of the Black Sea's depths could extend to the surface of the Black Sea. In 1999, there was a trip down the Danube, which highlighted the debris left in that river by the war over Kosovo. And indeed, during the Serbian leg of that voyage, the participants had to change ship because the whole river had been blocked by debris. In 2002, there was a voyage up the Adriatic coast, including some of the heavily polluted ports of Albania, which drew attention to the terrible chemical pollution, as well as the common cultural heritage of those littoral ports. In 2003, another European symposium, this time around the Baltic Sea, an enclosed stretch of water that was clogged in places by human detritus. And in all these locations, the Patriarch was able to emphasize the fact that the end of communism and the end of the Cold War had brought new opportunities and new imperatives for cooperation between countries, nations, faiths, which had not physically been able to communicate with each other before. Then, in 2006, there was an extraordinary organizational feat, an extraordinary act of courage in some ways by the Patriarch and the Patriarchate. A symposium took place near the Brazilian city of Manaus, in the heart of the endangered Amazon rainforest. The Patriarch led an impressively broad range of delegates, many representatives of the region, the governor of the state of Amazonas, for example, governors from all over Brazil, cabinet members, Marina Silva, who was at that time the Minister of Environment, a young woman, Minister of the Environment of Brazil, and they made a joint call against the illegal deforestation of the Amazon, which was having such a manifestly negative effect on the whole earth, not just Brazil, but the whole earth. At the point where two rivers converge to form the Amazon, His All Holiness performed the ancient Orthodox rite of the blessing of the waters. News of these proceedings was conveyed live to tens of millions of people in Brazil through television reports and newspaper articles. And this was the first time in the history of Brazil, that huge Christian country, where the principle had been established that concern for the environment could go hand in hand with organized Christianity. That was entirely new, something that nobody really had thought of much in Brazil until then. It greatly influenced a landmark meeting of Catholic bishops, which took place the following year, and that in turn very much influenced Pope Francis, who has said that his conversion to the idea of the environment as an important cause was to do with that Catholic meeting in 2007. So very, very important seeds were sown, which actually made a difference to the history of the world. Then, as I've mentioned, in 2007, there was a symposium which consisted of a voyage down the west coast of Greenland. At a human level, all these activities had a personal cost for the Patriarch. When he was in Brazil, for example, he not only made the very tiring flight from Lisbon to Manaus in the heart of Brazil, he also flew to a much more remote area where the problem of illegal deforestation was extremely acute. And partly as a result of his bearing of witness, the American company Cargill vowed to put a moratorium on taking soybeans from that place where illegal deforestation was an especially acute problem. So really, it's not an exaggeration to say that he drove himself to his own physical limits in these activities. On the Greenland voyage, I can tell you that he was very seasick at times. There were some choppy passages down that coast, and he didn't cope well with there were times when one could hardly walk up and down the deck of the ship, and that was a struggle for him. And yet, the moment when we reached the southern tip of Greenland, and we saw the oldest place of worship in the New World, a place where Christian Vikings had established a church around the year 1000, the Patriarch was very visibly moved. There was an Inuit elder of the community who greeted us in his own language, in Inuit, and his words were translated sentence by sentence into English by his daughter. And the opening of this Inuit leader's speech was a quote from Matthew chapter 8. Many will come from east and west and eat with Abraham in his kingdom. And there were many people like myself who choked up when they heard that. after these extraordinary voyages, there was a question then as to where else the patriarch could possibly go. He'd been to the Amazon, he'd been to the polar extreme of the world. Had these activities come to the natural end? Was it the end of a cycle? And there were some of us who felt that perhaps we should call these large symposia to a close at that point. And yet there was one more that proved to be extraordinarily prophetic. It was difficult to organize in some ways. It was one of his hardest. It was a symposium dedicated to the Mississippi River, and in particular to the port of New Orleans. This was after Hurricane Katrina, but it was before the terrible oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, this was a difficult symposium for the patriarch. He was in demand from many different quarters. Of course, the Greek Americans wanted their leader to be around them, and he responded very graciously to that. Of course, local environmental movements, people campaigning for the rights of poor people in New Orleans, people campaigning against the pollution of tap water and sort of inland water in Louisiana, wanted the time with the patriarch. He was stretched in many directions, and yet I think I can say that he responded very graciously, and he gave everybody their say. Now, since then, there have been no huge symposia. Perhaps the age of huge symposia is over, but he has relentlessly continued his bearing of witness on behalf of the earth. There have been two very valuable shorter meetings on the island of Chalki, Hebiliada. One of them was enjoyed the presence of Jane Goodall, one of the world's best-known environmental conservationists, who had always wanted to collaborate with the patriarch and was very honored and moved to be able to do so. There was another a couple of years ago which was devoted to the environment and the arts, and a remarkable range of academics and creative people, especially from the United States, converged on this small island. And just for a very, very short time, Chalki came alive again. And that wasn't the least of the benefits from this, that it was a way of bringing the Chalki monastery and seminary to life again for a few days, in a way that was very faithful to its spirit. I feel that the patriarch's activities have been of great benefit to mankind. He is a valued interlocutor with world leaders, literally ranging from American presidents, George Bush, Barack Obama, Fidel Castro, at least two French presidents, that's François Hollande and Jacques Chirac, have treated him as a very valued interlocutor. When François Hollande visited the Philippines and he visited areas stricken by typhoon, he brought the patriarch along. When the Paris negotiations on climate change were taking place, he insisted that the patriarch be present as a guest of honor. So he's become an honored interlocutor to the mighty of the world, and perhaps he forms a counterpart to the mighty of the world. Is that he is himself objectively in a very vulnerable position. Stalin was said to have asked mockingly about the Pope, how many divisions does the Pope have? How many military divisions? Well, the Pope doesn't have any divisions, but he is the head of a worldly state. The Holy See is a member of the United Nations. It has a diplomatic service. It has its Swiss Guard. It is a power in the world. Even Lambeth Palace, in a way, is a power in the world. The Archbishop of Canterbury ranks pretty high in the ceremonial order of precedence in England, I think above the Prime Minister, above the Lord Chief Justice. So you can say that the head of the Anglican Communion also has a certain amount of worldly power. The Pope certainly does. Patriarch Bartholomeos has absolutely no worldly power. He can only influence people by moral suasion, by example, by his own bearing of witness, by his own vulnerability. And I would put it to you that he has done that brilliantly, and that therefore those negotiations in Lausanne, which could so easily have gone the other way, were a kind of miracle.